I had imagined this day countless times, my little girl, radiant in white, walking down the aisle, and me sitting proudly at the front row, tears of joy threatening to fall. But life, as it often does, has a cruel sense of timing. When I arrived at the wedding venue, all the air of excitement and elegance I had pictured turned instantly cold. At the entrance, a photograph of me had been placed, taped to a sign with bold letters spelling, "Do not let that senile lady in." My heart skipped, but only for a moment. I could feel the stares, the whispers from the crowd, and yet I didn't falter. I turned around slowly, holding my composure, masking the storm of fury boiling beneath. My daughter had thought she could humiliate me publicly, shame me in front of everyone she cared about. She didn't realize, she still doesn't, that I have spent years quietly building influence, alliances, and protections. I am not a woman who can be silenced by a sign or a crowd. I walked to my car, carefully avoiding eye contact, and breathed deeply, letting the tension drain for a second. But the plan in my mind had already begun to take shape. While she celebrated what she thought was a triumph over me, I was already 3 steps ahead. For 2 hours, the wedding would proceed, and during those 2 hours, chaos would quietly seep in, the invisible hand of my control gently pulling strings, undoing the perfection she had so arrogantly assumed she possessed. Before we go any further, I want to pause for a moment. Please write in the comments where you're watching this from. And don't forget to like and subscribe so this channel can keep growing and bring you even more fascinating stories. I remember sitting in my car and just watching. The limousine had arrived, the bridesmaids were lined up perfectly, the flower petals strewn with precision. She was smiling, radiant, believing her triumph was complete. But I could feel the room's energy shift already, even from outside. She had spent months meticulously planning every detail, the floral arrangements, the seating, the catering, the music, all designed to showcase her vision of the perfect wedding. But perfection is fragile, and so is pride. I called one of my longtime contacts, someone who owed me favors silently over the years, and whispered a few words into the phone. By the time I hung up, small adjustments had begun in the background: catering delays, forgotten documentation for the venue, subtle technical mishaps that would confuse the guests and throw off the timing. Nothing too obvious yet, just enough to make her sense that the day wasn't as flawless as she had boasted about. It was important to let the storm build slowly for maximum effect. Meanwhile, whispers started circulating among the guests. A distant relative approached a staff member, questioning a missing license, and another noticed that the seating chart seemed off. They laughed nervously at first, thinking it was a mistake, but a news spread like wildfire. I could feel it, even sitting miles away, the sense of tension rising, the veneer of elegance beginning to crack. And my daughter? She had no idea who was orchestrating it. She thought it was bad luck or minor mistakes, but every domino falling was carefully planned. I reflected on her arrogance. She had always seen me as fragile, as an obstacle to be dismissed, an old woman whose time had passed. But she had underestimated years of strategy, the quiet power one accumulates when they are underestimated and ignored. I had spent my life building influence subtly, ensuring that even in my absence, I could move pieces on any board I chose. Today was simply the day I decided to use it. By now, some of the minor chaos had begun to affect the flow of the wedding. The photographer had arrived late. Certain staff members seemed confused, and subtle but crucial paperwork for the officiant was missing. Guests began exchanging worried glances, whispering behind gloved hands, and murmuring about whether the event was actually able to continue on schedule. From my vantage point, I could feel the shift. The balance of power had turned without a single person realizing it. And yet, I felt calm. I had no desire to yell, no need to physically storm the venue. True power is invisible. It moves quietly, with precision, and often when you least expect it. The smile on my daughter's face, radiant yet fragile, was the perfect counterpoint to the chaos I had set in motion. Her pride, so meticulously polished, would soon begin to crumble. She had thought this was her day to shine and assert control over me. But she had forgotten one vital lesson: control is never absolute, and underestimating the old comes at a price. I spent those hours observing and orchestrating, letting her missteps accumulate, the tension build naturally among guests and vendors. And as the clock crept forward, Each minute became a small victory, a reminder that even when we are pushed aside, even when we are labeled and dismissed, we can always find a way to assert our presence and power. Today, that presence would be felt, whether she was willing to admit it or not. I knew in that moment that the culmination of my years of preparation would not just be a small embarrassment for her, it would be a spectacle. A reminder that age, wisdom, and quiet influence are forces that should never be ignored. And I couldn't help but smile slightly at the thought. She had thought the photograph and the sign would diminish me, but instead, they had merely set the stage for the most satisfying form of revenge, the one that doesn't need to be announced, only executed. 2 hours later, when the first domino truly fell and the whispers turned into outright panic, she would realize that her perfect day had ended the moment she decided to humiliate me. But for now, I sat in my car, composed, watching the beginning of the chaos, savoring each small ripple, knowing that she would eventually understand. The old woman she mocked had always been quietly in control. From my car, I could see the grand entrance of the venue, the sprawling garden, the arches adorned with roses, the sparkling fountains. Everything looked perfect on the surface. And that was exactly the point. The more flawless it appeared, the sharper the fall would be. I knew my daughter would be blind to the cracks at first. Pride has a way of blinding people, especially those who think they've already won. As I observed, my phone buzzed with updates from those quietly assisting me. The florist had been delayed, the ice sculptures hadn't arrived on time, and one of the caterers had accidentally been sent to the wrong hall. Small inconveniences, easily dismissed by an outsider, but noticeable enough to create tension. Guests began to exchange puzzled glances. The elegant music faltered. The harpist had misread her sheet music, and suddenly the atmosphere that had seemed so controlled began to feel off. I remembered the day my daughter had tried to belittle me at a family dinner. She had smirked, telling everyone how old women like me just didn't understand modern celebrations. I had kept my composure then, smiling politely while my mind cataloged every slight. Years of being underestimated, of quietly watching and learning, had brought me to this exact moment. I would not just be vindicated, I would be the quiet force that brought her entire day to a halt. The guests were starting to murmur. My daughter glanced around nervously, her radiant smile faltering slightly. I could see the confusion flicker across her face as she whispered to her bridesmaids, wondering why the music was off, why the tables were rearranged, why the schedule seemed wrong. The calm and meticulous order she had assumed would carry the day was slipping, like sand through her fingers. I had spent decades cultivating influence, not through force, not through intimidation, but quietly behind the scenes. Friends in the right positions, vendors who owed favors, staff who respected my guidance without even realizing it. All of them had become part of a web of subtle control. And now, in these 2 hours, while she thought she had won, I was pulling the strings. Every misstep, every delay, every whisper of confusion was part of a plan that had been years in the making. Her father, my late husband, had taught me long ago that power is never loud. It is patient. It waits for the right moment to assert itself. And today, that moment had arrived. I allowed myself a small, knowing smile as I watched her try to maintain composure while everything began to unravel around her. The bridal party, flustered by minor errors that now seemed to compound exponentially, whispered frantically among themselves, trying to salvage the elegance she had demanded. By now, I had begun receiving updates from friends discreetly inside the venue. The officiant was confused about the paperwork. The photographer was chasing someone down for missing shots. The caterers were asking for clarification on last-minute changes. Each issue seemed small, almost accidental, but to anyone paying attention, the pattern was undeniable. My daughter's carefully curated wedding day, her image of perfection, was collapsing under its own weight and under mine. I remembered the humiliation of seeing that sign. Do not let that senile lady in. How audacious she had been, believing a simple piece of paper and a staged photograph could diminish me. But arrogance, after all, is a dangerous thing when aimed at someone who has lived long enough to learn patience, observation, and influence. My revenge would not be loud. It wouldn't be violent. It would be absolute and undeniable. Guests were starting to notice. Whispers grew louder, and the laughter that had accompanied greetings now sounded nervous, tentative. Some looked at each other with raised eyebrows, unsure what was happening. The mood shifted from celebration to uncertainty, and my daughter, sensing it, began to panic. I could feel her anxiety from miles away, her perfectly polished confidence beginning to crack. Even her closest friends and bridesmaids, who had been so loyal and supportive of her flawless image, were faltering under the weight of small mistakes. And me? I remained calm, seated in my car, a quiet observer. I had learned long ago that the true thrill of power isn't in confrontation, but in seeing events unfold exactly as you have quietly orchestrated them. 2 hours was all it would take. In 2 hours, every ounce of pride she had clung to, every image she had tried to project, would be shattered. And I would not even have to lift a finger in public. The day would end not with a bang, but with the realization that her attempt to humiliate me had backfired spectacularly. I thought of the family she had tried to impress, the friends who had gossiped about her and me, the judgmental eyes that had once looked at me with pity. They would all see what I had known all along. That age, experience, and quiet strategy can outmaneuver youthful arrogance every single time. And when the clock struck 2 hours, the world she had crafted for herself would crumble, and she would know that the old woman she tried to dismiss had been in control all along. By the time the first hints of real chaos reached the ceremony, a missing document here, a confused vendor there, I could feel the tension building, electric, palpable, and it was satisfying in a way that was almost sweet. My daughter had thought she was orchestrating the day, but she was merely a character in a story I had written long before she even arrived at the venue. And as the minutes ticked on, I allowed myself to reflect. Life had taught me patience, observation, and the subtle art of influence. And now, those lessons were paying off, not in silence, not in small victories, but in a spectacular, undeniable demonstration of the consequences of underestimating someone who has lived, watched, and quietly prepared for this very moment. By the time I parked a little ways down the street, I could hear the muffled sounds of confusion drifting from the venue, snippets of raised voices, the clatter of dropped plates, a harpist fumbling notes. I smiled to myself. That was the sound of a carefully balanced day beginning to tip, the first signs of the storm I had quietly orchestrated. I didn't hurry. I didn't need to. Patience was my weapon, and 2 hours of careful orchestration had only just begun to unravel everything. I stepped into the shadows near the side entrance and observed through a small gap in the hedge. From this vantage point, I could see her, my daughter, attempting to maintain composure while her smile faltered with every new mistake that cropped up. The flower arrangements were slightly off. Some tables were missing place cards, and the photographer had gotten lost on the way to the second room. Each small hiccup seemed innocent enough on its own, but together, they formed a chain reaction. Guests murmured in confusion, and I could see her hands tremble ever so slightly as she whispered instructions to her bridesmaids. The whispers became louder. I could hear snippets. Wasn't that supposed to be ready? I think someone forgot the rings. Didn't the officiant call an hour ago? Each question, each note of doubt, fed the tension, and I allowed myself a quiet chuckle. This was the culmination of years of careful observation, years of enduring her arrogance, her condescending looks, and her assumption that I had no influence. And now, quietly, flawlessly, the power was mine. The chaos wasn't just in the schedule or the logistics. It was in the secrets that had been bubbling just beneath the surface. I had ensured certain vendors, family members, and friends knew what to reveal and when. Conflicting whispers about hidden debts, old betrayals, and poorly kept promises began to surface. Guests who had once admired my daughter's perfect image now began to look at her with doubt, suspicion, and confusion. The carefully crafted facade began cracking, and I could see the panic forming in her eyes. 2 hours in, and she was starting to lose control completely. Her makeup, which had been flawless in the photos that would later flood social media, had begun to smudge under the stress. Her hands shook as she tried to direct staff, and her groom, confused and anxious, started to question what was going wrong. It was a silent coup, executed without confrontation, without anger, just the unstoppable weight of prepared influence. Even some of her friends, people she had relied on for support, were faltering under pressure. I had quietly ensured that small miscommunications would reach the wrong ears at the right moments. The caterer who had been given wrong instructions panicked and delivered the wrong appetizers. The florist had been instructed to hold back some key pieces of the arrangement. The photographer, overwhelmed by conflicting directions, missed critical shots. Each misstep seemed random, but to those paying attention, the pattern was unmistakable. And I was paying attention more than anyone else in the room. I had always been the silent observer in our family, the one everyone underestimated. When my daughter first showed me that sign, "Do not let that senile lady in," I felt a rush of determination. She thought she could humiliate me publicly and erase my influence in a single gesture. How little she understood the quiet patience of a woman who had spent decades learning who to trust, when to act, and how to control outcomes without anyone realizing it. The whispers reached me from the street. A guest accidentally mentioned an embarrassing family story in front of the wrong relatives. The music, which had started beautifully, faltered mid-song as a violinist misread a note. The officiant, frustrated by missing paperwork, called for a pause. And my daughter? She was spiraling, trying to reassure everyone while failing spectacularly. Panic replaced poise, and her once brilliant confidence dimmed with every passing minute. It was exhilarating to watch, not because I enjoyed cruelty for its own sake, but because I had been patient, measured, and deliberate for so long, and now the results of years of subtle strategy were coming to fruition. This was revenge, but not petty, not loud or shallow. It was elegant, unstoppable, public, and undeniable, and it would be remembered. Guests would talk about this day for years, long after the embarrassment of my daughter had faded into memory. And then, the moment that made everything irreversible. The wedding coordinator accidentally revealed something that should have remained hidden. A small document, a misfiled contract, exposed a long-running dispute over property that my daughter had tried to conceal. Conversations erupted around it. Gasps, murmurs, frantic questions. I had ensured this would surface at the precise moment when she had no control left. The energy shifted entirely. The perfect, polished celebration had become a scene of confusion and disbelief. My daughter tried to regain composure, tried to reassure herself and others that everything was fine, but it was too late. Everyone could see the cracks. Every carefully built illusion of control, elegance, and perfection she had tried to project was gone. And through it all, I remained the unseen hand. I had left quietly, smiled quietly, but orchestrated this chaos with precision. By now, even the groom was looking around nervously, noticing the tension, the whispers, and the mistakes. His pride began to crumble as he realized the day was no longer about their love story. It had become a spectacle of mismanagement and public embarrassment. And I, the senile lady, watched from a distance as my daughter's carefully constructed world collapsed in the shadow of the control she had underestimated. 2 hours after I left, the day was effectively over. The wedding had not ended because of me being physically present. No, it had ended because my influence, my patience, and my quiet power had been underestimated. Guests were leaving confused, frustrated, whispering, unsure what had happened. The pride my daughter had leaned on so heavily was shattered, her illusions stripped bare, and I remained calm, confident, and unshaken. It was a masterclass in quiet revenge, public, devastating, yet executed without confrontation, without raising my voice. And it was beautiful. 2 hours had been all it took for everything she assumed she controlled to slip away. I had done nothing openly, yet I had done everything. By the time I returned home later that afternoon, I could still feel the echoes of the chaos I had set in motion. The streets were quieter now, the guests gone, but the whispers and gossip would last for weeks, months even. My daughter had thought she could humiliate me and control the narrative, but the opposite had happened. I had turned her perfect day into a mirror reflecting everything she had tried to hide: arrogance, lies, and secrets that no amount of planning could conceal. I poured myself a cup of tea and allowed myself a moment to breathe. Not satisfaction in a petty sense, but a deep, calm recognition that justice, slow and precise, had been served. The beauty of my approach was in its subtlety. I hadn't shouted. I hadn't caused a scene. I had let the day run its course while every little domino fell exactly where I had placed it. It was like watching a painting complete itself, every brushstroke revealing the truth she had tried so hard to bury. By now, I was receiving calls, a few from shocked relatives who had witnessed what unfolded, some sympathetic, some in disbelief. One of my friends, who had been close to my daughter and her groom for years, called to apologize on their behalf, saying they had never seen anything like it. She asked if I would forgive them, and I only smiled. Forgiveness wasn't necessary. They had learned a lesson that would stay with them for a lifetime. They had thought they were clever, that they could humiliate me and diminish my power. Instead, they had revealed their own vulnerabilities for all to see. But of course, my daughter didn't understand this yet. That night, the calls and texts from her were frantic, apologetic, laced with fear. She realized that the day had not gone as planned, that her image was in tatters, and that her attempt to erase me had backfired spectacularly. I answered calmly, letting her stew in her guilt. I did not shout. I did not scold. I simply reminded her of one simple truth. Power that is underestimated is the most dangerous kind. She hung up after that, silence on the line, knowing she had crossed a line she could never undo. In the days that followed, the fallout continued. Photos and gossip spread through social media, videos of her panicked expressions, guests whispering, and small disasters playing out at the reception went viral among our circle. Her carefully curated reputation suffered far more than she had imagined. Friends who had attended began sending messages asking for clarification, some subtly hinting at past misdeeds or contradictions that only now seemed relevant. I did nothing but watch from a distance, letting the chaos reach its natural conclusion. I also began receiving calls from those who had long owed me respect, influence, or deference. Business partners, family members, and even distant acquaintances reached out with a newfound recognition. 2 hours of orchestrated chaos had not just ruined a day, it had shifted the balance of power entirely. They realized what I had always known, that age and calm patience could outweigh youth and arrogance every time. That a quiet, calculated approach could topple the most seemingly perfect plans without a single raised voice. My daughter, of course, tried to approach me afterward, but I remained unreadable. My presence, calm and composed, was a silent reminder that I had been in control all along. She attempted to apologize, but I knew it wasn't enough, not yet. There were lessons that needed to sink in slowly, truths that had to be understood through reflection and consequence rather than confrontation. I could see the panic in her eyes, the recognition that I had been underestimated, and that her attempt to diminish me had failed spectacularly. Meanwhile, the guests who had witnessed the disaster quietly began to reassess everything they thought they knew about our family. The whispers of chaos, the stories of secrets exposed, the subtle manipulations that had caused the day's unraveling, all of it circulated, making my daughter's attempt at control look fragile and naive. And all of this happened without me ever lifting a hand, speaking loudly, or creating a scene. It was a masterclass in power and influence, and I savored every moment. 2 days later, I received a formal apology from the venue manager, not just for any disruptions, but for the visible chaos that had erupted under my daughter's watch. Even strangers who had attended remarked on the drama, though they had no idea the hand behind it. And that, my dear listener, is the beauty of subtlety. You don't need to confront directly when you understand influence. You guide, you wait, and the natural order of consequence reveals itself. By the end of the week, the wedding was officially over in the eyes of the social world. Photos had been taken down, stories circulated, and my daughter's once pristine reputation had taken a blow from which it would take years to recover. And through it all, I remained the quiet, unshaken presence, a mother who had been publicly humiliated yet remained untouchable because her power had been underestimated. In private, I allowed myself a small smile. I hadn't acted in anger. I hadn't acted out of spite. This was not revenge in the emotional sense. It was justice, meticulously executed. And justice, when it's served with patience and foresight, is always far more satisfying than immediate retaliation. My daughter had learned a lesson in humility, in respect, and in the dangers of underestimating those who have quietly cultivated influence over decades. As I prepared for the weekend, I reflected on the events of those 2 hours. It had not been a day of confrontation, shouting, or direct humiliation. It had been far more powerful than that. My influence, my understanding, my patience, and my knowledge of human nature had turned a moment of public insult into a demonstration of my enduring control. And that, my dear listener, is the kind of power that no one forgets. By the following morning, My daughter was frantic. The reality of what had unfolded at her wedding had begun to sink in, and she was desperate to repair the damage to her carefully constructed image. She reached out to relatives, friends, and even some of the vendors, begging for sympathy, trying to spin the story, trying to regain control over something she had already lost. But it was too late. Once chaos has been unleashed, it rarely folds back neatly into the hands of those who caused it. I watched quietly from my study window as she made frantic phone calls and hurried through texts, her face pale, her hands trembling. There was a desperation in her movements that she had never shown before, and it was beautiful in a way, because it mirrored the panic I had felt many years ago when my own parents had tried to underestimate me. Power, my dear listener, is never given. It is understood, earned, and sometimes revealed in moments like this. Meanwhile, whispers began to reach me of what had happened 2 hours after I walked out. Guests who had been loyal to my daughter's image were now questioning her judgment, her character, and her relationships. They had seen cracks in her carefully constructed facade, arguments that erupted among bridesmaids, vendors being scolded publicly, and subtle hints that something was amiss with the groom's family. My daughter had assumed that excluding me would prevent embarrassment, but in truth, it had only highlighted her own flaws. By noon, I began receiving calls from people I hadn't spoken to in years, former colleagues, old friends, even distant relatives. They wanted to know the truth, what had happened, and most importantly, why I hadn't attended. Each call reinforced a quiet, undeniable truth. I had been underestimated, and the consequences of that underestimation had been both public and undeniable. People were curious, shocked, and fascinated, and all of it worked to my advantage. As the day wore on, my daughter attempted to salvage her wedding reception. She reached out to caterers, photographers, and musicians, trying to recreate the image of a perfect celebration. But it was clear to everyone that the event had already been fractured beyond repair. The energy that had once been joyful and anticipatory was now tense and awkward. Guests exchanged glances, whispers passed from table to table, and a sense of discomfort settled over the room. I could almost feel it from my own home, the ripples of my influence traveling faster than she could control. And then came the final blow. The truth of long hidden family matters began to surface. Old debts, hidden betrayals, and subtle manipulations I had quietly overseen for decades began to emerge, either through casual conversations, forgotten messages, or vendors who remembered past grievances. Guests realized that my daughter had not only tried to erase me from her wedding, but had also attempted to construct a narrative that hid inconvenient truths about her family. The irony was delicious. In trying to control perception, she had inadvertently revealed her own vulnerabilities. I stayed calm, sipping my tea and reviewing the messages and calls I had received. My daughter, once so confident, was now a whirlwind of panic, scrambling to contain what she could. But the damage was done. And all of this had unfolded in just a few short hours, a perfectly orchestrated cascade that I had allowed to happen naturally. It was the kind of power that doesn't shout. It doesn't demand attention. It simply exists quietly until it cannot be ignored. By late afternoon, the whispers had reached the local media. Not scandalous news, but enough for people in our community to know that the wedding had not gone as planned. A few photos circulated online showing tense smiles, awkward stances, and expressions of discomfort among the bride's family. I received a text from a friend simply saying, "I can't believe how calm you are. Everyone is talking about it." And I only smiled. Calmness, patience, and timing, these were the real weapons I wielded. I knew my daughter would try to approach me again. She would beg, plead, and attempt to charm, but I had no intention of allowing immediate reconciliation. Lessons, especially painful ones, must be felt deeply to be understood fully. She had tried to humiliate me in public, but I had turned the public stage into my instrument of control. The humiliation she intended for me had been redirected onto herself, and she was only beginning to understand the consequences of her actions. By the evening, I received a video clip from a family friend who had attended the wedding. It was brief, but telling my daughter and her new husband were seated, attempting to cut the cake, but the tension was palpable. Bridesmaids whispered to each other. The groom's family exchanged uncertain glances, and my daughter's face was pale and strained. It was as if the joy of the wedding had been replaced entirely by a subtle, suffocating panic. And all of this was the direct result of her underestimating me. Finally, I allowed myself a small sense of closure for the day. The public had seen what I had known all along. Power, respect, and influence are earned quietly. And when you attempt to erase someone who possesses them, the results can be catastrophic. My daughter had tried to diminish me, and instead, she had revealed the depth of my control. She had attempted to orchestrate my humiliation, but in doing so, she orchestrated her own undoing. And the truth of that was far more satisfying than any immediate confrontation or outburst. By the third day, the narrative had completely slipped out of my daughter's hands. What she thought would be a private family insult had become a public unraveling, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The guests who had attended the wedding were no longer whispering quietly. They were talking openly now, not just about the sign, not just about my absence, but about everything. About how she spoke to staff, about how the groom looked nervous and distant, about how the wedding felt off from the moment it began. And the most dangerous part, everyone was asking the same question. Why would a daughter do that to her own mother? That question spread faster than any lie she could invent. I still hadn't spoken to her. Silence, when used correctly, becomes louder than confrontation. She sent messages ranging from fake concern to outright panic. First, it was, "Mom, people are misunderstanding things." Then, "We need to talk before this gets worse." And finally, "Please, you're ruining my life." I didn't respond. Not because I couldn't, but because I didn't need to. The damage was already self sustaining. What she didn't realize, what she never realized, was that many of the people attending that wedding weren't there because of her. They were there because of me. Business associates, old family friends, community leaders, people who had known me long before she learned how to curate an image, people who remembered my generosity, my discretion, and my influence. Excluding me wasn't just cruel, it was strategically foolish. That afternoon, one of those people made a single phone call. Just one. A quiet call to the groom's uncle, a man who valued reputation above all else. By evening, the groom's family was asking questions. Hard ones. About finances, about character, about why the bride felt comfortable publicly humiliating her own mother. Doubt crept in, subtle but lethal. And doubt, once introduced into a marriage on its very first day, is poison. Meanwhile, I began receiving visitors. Not reporters, not strangers. People my daughter assumed were neutral, people she assumed were loyal to her. They came under the guise of concern, but their real reason was curiosity. They wanted to know what I planned to do next. That alone should tell you everything. They knew instinctively that I hadn't lost anything that day. I had gained leverage. I sat with them calmly, dressed impeccably, speaking softly. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't insult my daughter. I simply told the truth that I had been barred from my own child's wedding, that a sign calling me senile had been placed at the entrance, that I had left without confrontation because I believed dignity mattered more than spectacle. I let them react. I let them feel the outrage. People always project their own sense of justice when you give them just enough truth. By evening, the groom's parents had canceled the honeymoon. Officially, it was due to stress. Unofficially, it was because trust had already fractured. The groom had begun to wonder what else his wife was capable of if she could do something so calculated, so cruel, so public to her own mother. My daughter didn't know this yet. She was too busy trying to put out fires she couldn't see. Then came the financial chaos. The wedding vendors hadn't been fully paid. That detail had been carefully hidden from guests, but once scrutiny began, invoices resurfaced. Deposits were questioned. Contracts were reread. And suddenly, people realized that the wedding had been funded by promises, not security. Promises backed by my name, my reputation, which she had assumed she could discard without consequence. Vendors started calling me instead, not to complain, to verify, to ask if they should proceed with grace or prepare for legal action. I did neither. I simply declined responsibility. That single act sent shockwaves through the entire event structure. Without my implicit backing, her perfect wedding was suddenly a fragile illusion. By nightfall, the venue demanded resolution. The groom's family demanded explanations. And my daughter, once glowing with pride, was now crying in a room full of people who no longer saw her as powerful but reckless. 2 hours. That's all it took. 2 hours from the moment I turned away from that sign. By the end of the day, the wedding wasn't officially canceled, but everyone knew the truth. It was over. Not because guests left early or music stopped playing, but because the foundation had collapsed. Trust, respect, image, all gone. You can't celebrate a union when the rot is exposed at the altar. Late that night, she finally came to my house. She stood at the door for a long time before knocking. When I opened it, she looked smaller than I had ever seen her. Not younger, smaller. The confidence was gone. The entitlement had evaporated. She tried to speak, but no words came out. And for the first time in her life, she was standing in front of someone who was no longer willing to protect her from the consequences of her own choices. I invited her in. I let her sit. And then I told her something she would never forget. I didn't end your wedding, I said calmly. You did. The moment you decided I was disposable. She cried. She apologized. She blamed stress, influence, pressure. I listened. Then I stood up and reminded her of something far more important. Power does not come from humiliating others. It comes from knowing when you don't need to. She left that night knowing one thing for certain. Whatever control she thought she had over her life, her image, and her future was gone. And the woman she tried to erase, still standing, still calm, still in control. And I wasn't finished yet. The next morning, the aftermath of that wedding was everywhere. Word had spread like wildfire, as I knew it would. Social media posts, whispered conversations, even texts between vendors and family friends, they all carried the same shock and disbelief. My daughter thought she had hidden her cruelty behind the guise of a perfect day, but the world had already seen it, and I had made sure it wouldn't be ignored. I stayed calm, as always. Power thrives in silence until it speaks at the perfect moment. I didn't call her. I didn't demand apologies. Instead, I began contacting key people who could affect her future, her in-laws, her business associates, even the PR team she had relied on for years. I didn't accuse. I simply presented facts. The wedding had been mismanaged, the finances in question, and the vendors concerned. And every time I spoke, every person I contacted silently recognized who was actually in control. By mid-morning, the groom's family had called a meeting. I wasn't invited, but my influence was undeniable. Vendors were refusing to finalize contracts, and the family realized the liability could no longer be ignored. The illusion of a perfect marriage was now under scrutiny, and every decision my daughter had made without me was unraveling. Guests who had once cheered were now questioning the legitimacy of the entire event. Whispers became rumors, rumors became gossip, and gossip became outright confrontation. At that moment, I realized the scale of what I had orchestrated. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about revealing truth, exposing arrogance, and showing my daughter the consequences of thinking she could erase me from her life. I allowed her pride to collapse naturally, letting every person who witnessed the wedding understand the reality of her character. I became an invisible hand guiding chaos without ever stepping into the spotlight. By late afternoon, financial discrepancies started surfacing. Deposits had been misplaced, vendor payments missed, and contracts mismanaged, all things she had assumed I wouldn't notice. But I had noticed. And more importantly, I had quietly secured the documentation beforehand. Within minutes, I had multiple confirmations. Vendors were now reaching out directly to me, asking for instructions on how to proceed, knowing full well that without my approval, the situation would escalate legally. My daughter had unintentionally handed me leverage I had been building for decades. Then came the whispers among the guests. People were piecing together the discrepancies, connecting dots, and finally asking what everyone had been too polite to say. Was this really her doing, or did someone else orchestrate it behind the scenes? And in that moment, her so-called friends and allies began to distance themselves. No one wanted to be associated with a wedding that had publicly collapsed due to arrogance and cruelty. That evening, my daughter tried to salvage her image. She called, texted, even sent her friends to reason with me, but I wasn't moved. Not by tears, not by excuses, not by desperate attempts to regain control. Every plea reminded me of the countless times I had been dismissed, humiliated, and treated like I had no say in anything that mattered to her life. No, the roles had reversed, and I intended to keep them that way until she understood. By nightfall, the groom's family had pulled the groom aside, demanding explanations. Questions were asked that my daughter could not answer. The financial chaos, the vendor complaints, the whispering guests, it all came together in a perfect storm. And the groom, for the first time, began to see the reality behind the facade. The woman he married was not only cruel to her mother, but she had no foresight, no loyalty, no respect. I watched from the sidelines as her carefully constructed world collapsed. Not maliciously, deliberately, yes, but with precision. Every person who mattered had seen the cracks. Every alliance she had assumed was secure now questioned her judgment. And the most important part? She had no idea I had orchestrated much of this behind the scenes. She thought the universe itself was punishing her. Little did she know it was me, calm, silent, and entirely in control. By the end of the evening, she finally came to my house, exhausted, panicked, and utterly broken. She had no words at first, only apologies, tears, and excuses. I let her speak. I let her plead. But I also reminded her of everything she had done to deserve this reckoning: humiliation, exclusion, disrespect. It had all led to this moment. And most importantly, I let her know that while the wedding had been her stage, the real power had always been in my hands. I didn't yell. I didn't scream. I simply told her, "You wanted to erase me, to humiliate me. Look around. Who is truly in control?" That night, as she left, she knew two things with absolute certainty. One, she could not undo what had happened. And two, her mother, the woman she tried to humiliate, was still the one holding the strings. And this was far from over. The moment stretched as if time itself had frozen. But I remained calm, seated in the shadows of the grand hall, unseen yet entirely in control. My daughter's wedding, the day she had imagined would mark her triumph, had become a spectacle of chaos and whispered accusations, all because she underestimated me. For 2 hours, I let it unfold, letting her pride suffocate in the growing tension, letting the guests murmur, letting the cracks in her carefully crafted image spread like wildfire. When the murmurs finally escalated into outright confrontation, I stood. The room seemed to inhale as if sensing the shift. All eyes turned toward me. My calm, composed face met the panic, confusion, and shame in theirs. My daughter's eyes widened in disbelief, her carefully painted smile faltering as she realized the truth. I had been silently orchestrating everything, and the humiliation she had tried to inflict on me had backfired spectacularly. I walked slowly toward the center of the room, every step deliberate, measured. Guests shuffled back, unsure, their whispers drowning in the heavy silence. The wedding planner tried to intervene, but no one spoke above me. I lifted my hand, and the room fell silent. I explained in steady, measured tones the web of influence I had quietly held over the years: financial, social, legal. Every decision, every resource, every contingency had been carefully aligned. The very company my daughter worked for, the investments she depended on, the trust funds she thought she could access freely, everything was under my control. By now, my daughter's face had drained of color. Her groom looked equally bewildered. Friends and relatives who had giggled at my exclusion now saw the magnitude of what she had attempted. The tables had turned. My calm authority replaced her panic. She tried to speak, to justify herself, but her words faltered, swallowed by the weight of my presence. Her perfect wedding day had ended the moment she tried to push me aside. I reminded them, gently but firmly, that the facade of control was fragile, that arrogance and cruelty, especially toward one who has quietly held power, always come at a cost. Every secret they had tried to hide, every manipulation they had counted on, now emerged under the scrutiny of the gathered witnesses. By the time I finished speaking, the once proud bride was pale, trembling, and silent. The room was quiet, not in respect for her, but in awe of me. After what felt like an eternity, I turned and walked away, leaving the chaos behind. I didn't shout. I didn't gloat. My calm departure spoke louder than any words. The wedding had unraveled without my raising my voice. My influence had been enough. Guests lingered, whispering among themselves, digesting the truth of what had happened. My daughter's world had collapsed quietly, but completely. a lesson in humility she would never forget. As I stepped outside, the sun touched my face, warm and forgiving. I felt the weight of years lift from my shoulders. Revenge, I realized, was not in confrontation, it was in the quiet, patient orchestration of justice. The humiliation intended for me had been mirrored onto the one who had tried to humiliate me, and I had done it with grace, patience, and precision. I left the venue with my dignity intact, my power acknowledged, and my lesson delivered. My daughter would remember this day, not as her triumph, but as the day she realized she had underestimated the strength of her own mother. And as for me, I had walked through betrayal, humiliation, and disrespect, and emerged not just unscathed, but elevated. The wedding may have begun as a celebration, but it ended as a testament to quiet authority, patience, and the irreversible consequences of arrogance. I would return to my home, to the life I had built with care and resilience. The world would whisper of the chaos that had unfolded, of the daughter who had tried to dominate and the mother who had quietly commanded. And I would smile, calm and mysterious, knowing that the power of patience and the art of silent influence had prevailed once again.